Karen Whitfield stood on my porch at 7:42 on a Saturday morning, phone camera already recording, and said the sentence that would end her own 6-year reign as HOA president. "I've counted 6 cars in your driveway and on the street and by our bylaws. That makes this a boarding house." I laughed. She didn't. 6 weeks later, she wouldn't even show up to her own board meeting. My address is 118 Bellwood Court, in a subdivision called Maple Creek Estates, the kind of place with matching black mailboxes, HOA-approved shutter colors, and a homeowners association that took itself far too seriously. I'd lived there 4 years. I worked from home 3 days a week as a logistics project manager, which meant I saw everything the neighborhood did during daylight hours. The landscaping crews arriving at 8 a.m. sharp, the Amazon vans circling the cul-de-sac twice a day, the slow parade of golden retrievers on matching leashes at exactly 6 p.m., and I saw Karen Whitfield. Karen had been HOA president for 6 years, re-elected every February by a suspiciously consistent 14 votes out of the roughly 90 households in the neighborhood. She was 54, drove a white Lexus SUV with a Maple Creek parking permit displayed like a badge of honor on the windshield, and treated the community bylaws the way some people treat scripture, selectively and always in her own favor. She signed every email "Warm regards, Karen," which I eventually learned meant the opposite of warm. Her front lawn at 122 Bellwood Court was always the neighborhood's showpiece, trimmed to exactly 2.5 inches, edged every Sunday, a string of solar path lights she'd installed herself, even though the exterior lighting policy technically required board pre-approval for anything beyond the standard fixture. Most of my neighbors kept their heads down around her. HOA meetings drew maybe 8 or 9 people out of 90 households, which was exactly how Karen liked it. Fewer eyes meant fewer questions, and fewer questions meant 6 consecutive years of re-election by the same small, loyal handful of attendees. I liked my life there mostly. My sister Denise lived 40 minutes away with her husband and their 2 kids, my niece Mia and my nephew Colton. And every third weekend, they'd pack up and stay with me, sleeping bags spread across the living room floor, cereal boxes lined up on the counter. A bounce house rented for Colton's 9th birthday that took up half the backyard. My parents drove down from 2 states over a few times a year and stayed the whole weekend too, usually with a cooler full of my mom's cooking that lasted me a week after they left. It was loud, it was messy, driveways got full, and it was exactly what I wanted my house to be. My street, Bellwood Court, curved into a quiet cul-de-sac where kids still rode bikes after dinner, and for 4 years none of that had ever been a problem. Not once. Then, on the second Saturday of March, Karen showed up at my door with her phone already out, already filming, and informed me that Section 4.3 of the Maple Creek Estates Declaration of Covenants limited overnight guest parking to 2 vehicles for more than 3 consecutive days. And that 6 vehicles, my car, Denise's minivan, my parents' truck, and 3 cars belonging to friends who'd come for Colton's birthday, put me in violation of what she called the transient occupancy clause. She used that exact phrase twice, like she'd rehearsed it in the mirror. "It's my nephew's birthday party," I told her. "They're leaving Sunday. Rules don't have an exception for birthdays," she said. 6 cars is 6 cars. It's been like this before, nobody's ever said anything. Well, someone's saying something now. Then she smiled, that particular Karen smile, closed-lipped, eyes narrowed just slightly, the one that says I already know I've won, and told me she'd be filing a formal complaint with the board first thing Monday. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured a phone call, maybe an apologetic email, would clear it up once she cooled down. I was wrong. On Wednesday, a certified letter arrived, notice of covenant violation dated March 11th, citing Section 4.3, warning of a $150 fine if the violation recurred, and a stiff paragraph reminding me that guest vehicles exceeding the permitted limit for consecutive overnight periods constitute a Tier 2 infraction subject to escalating penalties. It was signed by Karen Whitfield, HOA president, in a loopy cursive that looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror right alongside that smile. I called the HOA management office. The woman who answered, a soft-spoken property manager named Rosa, told me the complaint had come directly from the board president, and that per policy, it had already been logged before I even opened the envelope. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that this was the 4th complaint Karen had personally filed against a homeowner that quarter. 4, in 3 months. I asked who else had been targeted. Rosa said she couldn't share that, but she didn't sound surprised by the question, and there was a pause on the line that told me more than her answer did. That should have been my first real clue that this wasn't about a birthday party at all. 2 weeks later, my parents came back for a weekend, along with my girlfriend at the time, Priya, whose car sat in my driveway for 4 straight days. Karen was there again, not knocking this time, just standing at the end of my driveway with a clipboard counting. I watched her from the kitchen window while I made coffee, writing something down, taking a photo of each license plate like she was building a case file. Because she was. I went out to get the mail that afternoon and she was still there, clipboard tucked under one arm now. 4 cars again, she said before I'd even reached the box. I hope you understand this is the pattern I'm required to document. It's my family, I said, they visit. That's what families do. She didn't answer that. She just wrote something else down and walked back toward her own driveway, where I noticed for the first time there were already 3 cars parked that didn't belong to anyone who lived at 122 Bellwood Court. The second letter came 9 days later. This one wasn't a warning. It was a $300 fine doubled from the first, citing a repeat Tier 2 violation. And it added something new. A line stating that a third infraction would result in the matter being referred to the association's attorney and a lien being placed on my property until the fine was paid in full plus legal fees. A lien on my house. Over house guests staying for a long weekend. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that letter, feeling something shift from confused to genuinely furious. I called Rosa again, and this time whether out of frustration or exhaustion. She let something slip she probably shouldn't have. Karen herself hosted gatherings almost every single weekend, cars lining both sides of Bellwood Court from Thursday evening through Sunday night, sometimes a dozen vehicles at once, sometimes more. There had never been a single complaint filed against her. Not one in 6 years. Because, Rosa explained carefully, complaints against the board president had to be rooted through and effectively approved by the board president before they were formally logged. I sat with that for a long moment, the letter still in my hand, half expecting a courier to show up at the door with lien paperwork before I'd even finished processing it. Then I asked Rosa one question. Was there any way to see the full complaint history for the neighborhood going back at least a year? She said HOA records were technically available to any homeowner in good standing under the association's own governing documents, and that I'd need to submit a formal written records request to the board to get the full file. Before I did anything else, I called my college roommate Marcus, who'd gone on to practice real estate law 2 states away. I read him Section 4.3 over the phone, then the lien threat, then Karen's cursive signature at the bottom, which he couldn't see but somehow still seemed to picture perfectly. He laughed, not unkindly, and told me almost exactly what I'd later find printed in the state statute. An HOA fine built on selectively enforced rules is precisely the kind of fine that collapses the moment a homeowner asks for the enforcement records behind it. Get the spreadsheet, he told me. Get it in writing. Boards panic over paper trails, not arguments. That one phone call changed the entire shape of what I was about to do next. I submitted that request the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. What came back 12 days later, after 2 follow-up emails and 1 phone call where Rosa audibly exhaled what sounded like relief that someone had finally asked, was a spreadsheet. 18 months of logged complaints laid out in rows. 41 of them had been filed by residents against other residents, and every single one had been reviewed, fined, or escalated within 2 weeks of being filed. But there was a second column, quieter, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. 17 complaints filed against Karen Whitfield's own property at 122 Bellwood Court, dating back to the previous June. Noise after 10 p.m. Unpermitted parking, string lights that violated the exterior lighting policy, a fire pit that ran afoul of the association's open flame restrictions. Every single one of them marked in the same handwriting, reviewed, no action taken. I photographed every page of that spreadsheet before I could talk myself out of it. Then I pulled up the state's Homeowners Association Act, the one Rosa had casually mentioned, and read the exact language out loud to myself twice, because I couldn't believe how clean it was. Association boards were legally required to enforce covenants uniformly across all homeowners and selective enforcement, applying rules to some residents while quietly exempting others. Especially board members could void the specific fine being contested and expose the board itself to legal liability. I wasn't the only one who'd been paying attention either. When I mentioned the fines to my neighbor Frank, 3 houses down, at the mailboxes on a Tuesday evening, his whole face changed. He told me Karen had fined him $200 the year before for parking his own boat trailer in his own driveway for 5 days. A boat trailer he'd since learned was explicitly permitted under Section 6.1 for temporary recreational equipment storage. He'd paid the fine rather than fight it, because at the time he had no idea there was anything to fight. Two other neighbors, the Alvarez family and a retired schoolteacher named Grace, had strikingly similar stories once I started asking around. Grace had been fined $175 for a garden gnome collection Karen personally described, in writing, as unsightly and inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. A complaint with no cited bylaw section at all because there wasn't one to cite. I typed up everything I had, the spreadsheet. The 17 unenforced complaints against Karen's own address. The exact statute language on uniform enforcement quoted directly, Frank's boat trailer bylaw citation. Grace's gnome complaint with no legal basis whatsoever. I requested a spot on the agenda for the next board meeting, scheduled for the second Thursday of April, and I put 3 questions in that request, in writing so there could be no confusion later. Was Section 4. 3 being applied uniformly across all households? Why had 17 documented complaints against the HOA president's own property resulted in 0 fines over 18 months? And would the board be reviewing that discrepancy alongside my own case before any lien could be filed? The meeting was held in the clubhouse, folding chairs arranged in slightly uneven rows, a whiteboard with the HOA logo taped crooked at one corner. Karen sat at the head table between the treasurer and the secretary, a stack of papers squared in front of her, that same closed-lipped smile already in place as I walked in. She clearly hadn't expected me to bring anything more than a complaint of my own. She definitely hadn't expected Frank, Grace, and the Alvarez family to walk in right behind me and take seats together in the front row. When my item came up on the agenda, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I read the complaint spreadsheet numbers out loud, the 17 unenforced violations logged against 122 Bellwood Court, Karen's own house, and then the state statute on uniform enforcement, word for word, straight off my phone. I watched her expression change in real time, the smile flattening into something tighter and thinner, her eyes flicking toward the treasurer like she needed backup that wasn't coming. That spreadsheet isn't relevant to your violation, Karen said, her voice a half step higher than before. It's exactly relevant, I said. The statute says enforcement has to be uniform. It isn't, that's not my opinion, that's the state's. I don't appreciate the implication, she said, glancing again at Harold, who did not look back at her this time. I'm not implying anything, I said, I'm reading it out loud. This meeting isn't the venue for personal attacks, Karen said, her hand flat on the table now, pressing down like it might steady something. It's not personal, I said. It's 18 months of the same handwriting saying 2 different things depending on whose house it is. A few chairs behind me, someone let out a short, involuntary laugh. Karen's jaw tightened, and for the first time in 6 years of watching her run that room, I saw her look genuinely unsure of what to say next. Then Frank stood up, unprompted, and told the room about his boat trailer fine and the bylaw section that actually protected it. Grace stood next and talked about her garden gnomes and the $175 fine she'd paid because she hadn't known back then that she could push back at all. The Alvarez family described a fine over a basketball hoop that had sat in the exact same spot for 3 years before anyone suddenly complained about it. One by one, 4 separate households laid out 4 separate stories that all traced back to the same signature, the same loopy cursive, the same uneven enforcement. The treasurer, a quiet man named Harold I'd barely exchanged 10 words with in 4 years, finally spoke up from the head table. He said plainly that the board had a fiduciary and legal obligation to review every complaint equally, including complaints filed against sitting board members, and he moved to open a formal review of all 17 unenforced complaints against Karen's property, alongside a full audit of enforcement practices going back 2 full years. The motion passed 5-1. Karen cast the only no vote, and even that seemed to land with less weight than she clearly wanted it to. My $300 fine was rescinded that same night, the board citing documented selective enforcement as grounds for dismissal, recorded in the official minutes. Frank's boat trailer fine from the year before was refunded in full within the week. Grace's gnome fine was refunded too, along with a formal written apology added to the permanent record. The board scheduled Karen's own property for a full covenant review at the following meeting, the same 48-hour notice, the same fine schedule, the same standard she'd used against the rest of us for 6 straight years. She didn't show up to that meeting, or the one after it. By the 3rd meeting, the vice president had quietly stepped into the acting president role, and a notice went out to every household announcing that the HOA presidency would be up for a special election in June, following a change in board leadership. Karen's name wasn't on the ballot. I heard through Rosa weeks later that Karen had finally paid the fines the audit turned up against her own property. The fire pit the string, lights the noise complaints she'd waved away for a year and a half, quietly by mail. Without ever appearing at a single meeting to contest any of it, I still live at 118 Bellwood Court. My sister still comes over every third weekend with the kids and the sleeping bags and the cereal boxes lined up on the counter, and nobody stands at the end of my driveway with a clipboard anymore. The new acting president. A retired engineer named Diane who'd lived on Bellwood Court almost as long as Karen had run, it sent out a short neighborhood email in July, confirming that enforcement logs would now be reviewed by 2 board members instead of 1. And that any complaint involving a sitting board member's own property would automatically be handled by an outside management reviewer. Small changes on paper. They mattered more than they sounded. What stuck with me wasn't really the money, though getting that $300 back felt genuinely good. It was realizing how much of that unfairness had been sitting there in plain sight for 18 months, in a spreadsheet nobody had ever bothered to actually ask for. All it took was 1 records request and 4 neighbors willing to say, out loud in the same room, that they'd noticed it too. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that seemed to run on one set of rules for you and a completely different set for whoever happened to be sitting at the head of the table, you already know exactly the feeling I'm describing here. Tell me your version in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly some of the stories people share are wilder than mine ever was. If this one kept you hooked until the very end, a like helps more than you'd probably think. And subscribing just means you won't miss it the next time somebody's homeowners association finally meets its match.